What are some of the challenges these young people face?
Well, again, it sort of depends upon the layers of marginality that they experience. Some people who might be a visible minority, some people who could be sexual minorities, they would experience homelessness in different ways than, say, a white male might experience homelessness. So it's important to look at the diversity of the population to say, well, how do these, what challenges do young people face? I think it depends upon their situation. So that's a starting point that I would offer. But generally speaking, lack of income is a key component. You're talking about young people who are unhoused. Many do not have a high school diploma. Many do not have employment experience. So trying to get a job when you haven't got a high school certificate, trying to get a job when you haven't got employment experience, you haven't got a resume, can be really, really challenging. So that's the income element is really important. Also, the experience of not having been living independently. I mean, it's hard enough for young people who are even transitioning from maybe their homes to university. That can often lead to a difficult transition. But leaving a troubled home to the streets, well, that's a real different transition, and independent living in that context is really important. And again, is really a struggle for many young people. They don't really have the understanding to live independently without some sort of supports. Oftentimes, young people who are homeless, especially if they're visibly homeless, are targets for predators, those who may want to recruit these young people, especially females, into the sex trade. That's a key element that's a real challenge for many young people. And related to that, a lot of young people, especially those who spend considerable time in public places, they're subject to criminal victimization. They're targeted. They're targeted for being robbed, for being assaulted, being sexually assaulted. We've been doing some research in recent years looking at levels of victimization of homeless youth compared to youth who are housed, and levels of victimization are at least double, even more than that for young people who are homeless. It's not just they've experienced victimization, say, once in the past year, but many have experienced it multiple times. So that's a really important point, that young people who are homeless, they're victims to criminal victimization often, regularly. And often people think of street youth as being sort of involved in crime. Well, certainly some are to various degrees, but often overlooked are their experiences of victimization. I think that's a really important point for students to understand, is that young people who are homeless, they're much more likely to be victimized than they are to engage in criminal activity. So those are some of the, the broad elements that should be accounted for by looking at the challenge that young people face when they're homeless.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and certainly it is sort of contrary to what students might think or what the public perception might be, that young people tend to be more involved on committing the crime. But reality, we know, is they really are the victims more often.
So I think that's true. I think the public has this sort of perception that often it's fostered by the media, that young people or even homeless people in general are more likely to be involved in crime. And often you'll hear, police reports that are mentioned on the media that this person was involved in a crime and they are from no fixed address. I mean, that obviously is code word for being homeless, right? So that's sort of the impression that people often get, is that people who are homeless, they're involved in crime and they're to be avoided, to be feared. And I think that's true to some extent, but a much larger extent is this aspect of being overrepresented as victims of crime.